Let's say you were tasked to pick out the best player in the NBA, the season MVP. A potential list of contenders would probably include some combination of these familiar faces. Jokic, Giannis, Luka, Shea, Tatum, Durant, LeBron, Steph, Edwards. Maybe a few more, maybe a few less, but roughly we'd be looking at the best players in the NBA. But how does the NBA pick the best player? Who gets to vote? For example, I might think that someone like Devin Booker should be on that list, and you might think Jalen Brunson should be included. How do we reconcile having these differences of opinion? Like voting for the NBA MVP, many of us watching this video are going to be voting for a president soon. What if I told you that the answer to this question of how we choose between NBA players for MVP might actually help solve some of American politics' biggest problems? Well, it's essentially the same question that NBA MVP voters have to tackle every season. The MVP is selected by a panel of sports journalists who are invited to be a part of the process. Instead of picking just one player, the voters vote for first, second, third, fourth, and fifth place on their ballots. They rank their top players 1 through 5. So for an example, our hypothetical voter might put Giannis at 1, Luka at 2, Tatum at 3, Shea at 4, and Edwards at 5. Someone else's ballot may be Jokic, Shea, Luka, Giannis, and then Jalen Brunson. They both have 3 players the same but in different orders, and they were both free to pick 2 players completely different from one another. This type of voting system is often called ranked choice voting, and it's essentially what the NBA uses to decide the league MVP every season. By allowing votes 1 through 5, the NBA is getting a more complete picture of the season and who voters think should be awarded. Now, in addition to ranking each choice, the NBA gives a point score that is tallied up by each place vote. So a first place vote is 10 points, second place is 7 points, third is 5 points, fourth is 3 points, and fifth is 1 point. The player with the most total points wins the MVP for the season. The goal isn't just to be the number 1 on someone's ballot, but to get second and third place votes, accumulating the highest total score. In theory, if there's a lot of disagreement on who should be number 1 in the voting, but a single player is consistently number 2, they could win MVP with fewer number 1 votes than other players. The goal of this system is a complete picture. The goal is to achieve a consensus amongst the voters selecting for the MVP. So let's take a look at the actual outcome of the voting for the 2023-2024 season as an example. This is what the final vote looked like. Jokic received 79 first-place votes, finishing with 926 total points, winning the MVP. Shea and Luka came in second and third place. The beauty of this kind of voting is it allows for people to express what they actually believe. For example, Giannis finished in 4th place in voting, but Jalen Brunson actually had more second-place votes. 3 people felt the freedom to say, we think Jalen Brunson had the second best season in the league, period. This kind of voting also gives you the ability to express unpopular opinions. We can even see this at the bottom of the list. Kevin Durant snuck onto the 5th slot of someone's ballot, Eddie Johnson, garnering him a single point. I don't actually know if he has a vote. And someone even stood out on a ledge, making Sabonis 4th on their list when no one else had him listed at all. But being able to vote for your actual preference could potentially be a big improvement. So what would it look like if we could use this kind of voting system for our political elections? You may not get to vote for NBA MVP, but you very likely have the opportunity to vote in an election very soon. And if you vote in the American elections, you may feel exhausted by politics. I know I often am. Elections sometimes feel like you're holding your nose and voting more against a candidate than for a candidate. And this is totally logical and almost certainly how you should vote in our current system. Third-party candidates often become a spoiler for the major candidate they most closely align with, which results in the opposite candidate winning. This is called the spoiler effect, when voting for your favorite candidate ends up indirectly helping the candidate that you like the least. And it's one of the biggest issues with our current voting system. So if you feel strongly about your ideological positions, it only makes sense that you vote for the more viable candidate, even if they weren't your first choice. You have to vote strategically instead of for your preference. Think of it like this: voting for Kyrie for MVP hurts Luka. Voting for Booker hurts Durant. Voting for AD hurts LeBron. It's a zero-sum game, and if you aren't strategic, you'll likely end up further away from your desired outcome. But beyond the spoiler effect, there are many drawbacks to our current system, which we'll list here. Number one, the winner of our current system frequently gets under 50% of the vote. Number two, it naturally limits the choice for voters to just two parties. And number three, it encourages negative campaigning. This might sound crazy, but let's look at each of them. So for the first one, the winner of our presidential vote in our current system often ends up getting less than half or 50% of the vote. And I think this is one of the biggest problems in our current voting system. You may not realize it, but nearly 1/3 of all American presidential elections have resulted in the winner not receiving above 50% of the vote. Here are all of those elections listed out and the winning percentage beside them. Even crazier, in these 5 elections, the winner didn't even receive the most votes. In a rational world, we would never design a system where there would be a way for a candidate to win while coming in second place, but that's a uniquely American problem with the Electoral College, and a different topic for a different video entirely. Perhaps the most surprising thing is how often no candidate has the support of at least half the country. Look at 1824, only 32.7%, less than 1/3 of people voted for that eventual president. Let me put it like this: I've been alive for 8 going on 9 presidential elections. In my lifetime, the only times a president has been elected by a majority of people in the country has been 2004, 2008, 2012, and 2020. Half of the time, half of the elections. And I know it might sound pedantic, but what's important about this is that votes represent people. You. A president with 50% or more of the votes, in theory, has the support of half of the people of the country. When a politician wins with less than 50% of the vote, it essentially means they come into office with more people voting against them as a candidate than for them. And we wonder why everyone's always so upset. I contend that a good system is one that at least reaches some level of consensus. It's never going to be perfect, but some agreement that a majority of people wanted this outcome. But one of the things that makes that difficult to achieve in our current system is the way that our current system limits our choice as voters. Are you sick of just two parties? Does a false ideological binary not adequately represent your beliefs? Well, welcome to the club. If you want more options, one of the best ways to empower smaller parties and independent candidates is to give them an actually viable path to victory. By changing the system to limit the spoiler effect, people are more willing to express their true preferences and vote for smaller candidates and parties. And of course, our current system also results in negative campaigning. And this is almost entirely because of the spoiler effect. Candidates run a ton of negative ads. Why? Because it works. They don't need to talk as much about what they are going to do. They need to try to convince you that voting for the other candidate is not an option. This isn't a bug in our system. It's what our system directly incentivizes. Don't you hate negative campaign ads and that crazy voice?
Jason Tatum has never been an elite 3-point shooter in his life.
If we want the ads to stop, we need to change the incentives. As long as it's more effective to disqualify the other candidate than it is to win your vote by earning it, the candidates will always rely on negative ads. They have to. It's what works in this system. But if we wanted to, we could learn from how the NBA does MVP voting and apply that to our elections, and I think it would solve a lot of these problems. So let's look at how that would work. The NBA uses a kind of voting system called ranked choice voting, and it's one of several voting systems that would potentially solve some of the problems that arise in our current system. Here's a simple version of how it could work. Let's take our top 5 NBA MVP vote getters from last year and imagine they were all running in an election. Nikola Jokic of the Nuggets party, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander of the Thunder party, Luka Doncic of the Mavericks party, Giannis of the Bucks party, and of course, Brunson of the Knicks party. Ideologically, they may look something like this, with everyone closer ideologically to the candidate beside them, with Giannis and Brunson the furthest away from one another. And to avoid any left-right implications, let's call Giannis' side of the spectrum big man and Brunson's side small guard. Luka on this spectrum is right in the middle. In our current electoral system, elections typically end up with just 2 candidates. In this case, it would be probably Jokic and Shai, and they run against each other. So the voters who may prefer Giannis vote for Jokic just to keep Shai from winning, even though Jokic has some small guard skills like ungodly passing. And Brunson voters may vote for Shai, even though at 6'6" and much taller than Brunson, voters may feel that Shai is pushing into larger guard territory. Which means that the election often comes down to the small number of voters in the middle. Do Luka voters vote for Jokic or do they vote for Shai? Maybe it changes back and forth year to year. In some years, a candidate like Brunson may decide, you know what, I'm going to throw my hat into the ring. But taking some of the votes that would have gone for Shai means that Jokic is now definitely going to win. This is that spoiler effect in action. Third-party candidates can't win in our system. And who knows, maybe Jokic was paying for Brunson's campaign behind the scenes the whole time, knowing that it would only help him if he ran. I know, it's madness, but this is our system. Instead, let's look at how this would work with ranked choice voting. Each voter would get a ballot with the candidates' names, and they can then rank 1 through 5 of their preferred candidates. If they want to stop after only 1, they can. If they want to do all 5, they can. It's up to them, it's their preference. So far, this isn't too dissimilar of the type of voting done in the NBA MVP race. Instead of assigning points, however, we can count the votes and have what is called an instant runoff. We're basically simulating multiple elections. So just for our purposes, let's assign some vote totals. Let's say out of 150 votes, Jokic gets 50 votes, Shai gets 40 votes, Luka gets 30 votes, Giannis gets 20 votes, and Brunson gets 10 votes. Now, if this was the old system, Jokic would have already won with 33% of the vote. But the goal of ranked choice voting is to get to a consensus, so that means we need to continue until a candidate gets over 50%. With an instant runoff, we can eliminate the candidate with the least number of votes from contention. In this case, Brunson is eliminated. His 10 votes are then looked at again for who Brunson voters' second choice is. In this case, since Brunson voters are more ideologically aligned with Shai voters on the big to guard spectrum, Brunson voters overwhelmingly choose Shai as their second choice. To keep things simple in our example, I'll assign them all together, but it is important to note that each second choice is assigned individually. They aren't moved as a block. So in the second round of the runoff, the results are Jokic with 50, Shai with 50, Luka with 30, and Giannis with 20. The runoff continues until a candidate has greater than 50% of the vote. In this case, Giannis is eliminated and his 20 votes go to the next preference still in the race. In this case, they go to Jokic. Jokic 70 votes, Shea 50 votes, Luka 30 votes. Down to 3, Jokic is almost at that 50% threshold. We eliminate Luka from contention, but where do his votes go? Well, let's just say in this hypothetical, the Luka's votes go to Shea as the primary ball handler on his team, and it gives us this result. Shea 80 votes, Jokic 70 votes. And with that, Shea finally passes the 50% threshold with 53% of the vote. A big swing from at the very beginning when Jokic looked like the clear winner. But of course, this is just an example and obviously a very simplified version. Luka's votes would likely be split, and not everyone will rank multiple candidates. And people's political preferences are often much more complicated than it would seem like in an example here. But the strength and goal of the system is to get a consensus. In the first round, Jokic would have won, but the preferences of all of the voters ended up preferring Shea. So how would this address the problems that we already talked about in our current system? For the issue of not always receiving 50% of the vote, ranked choice voting is by design created to gain a consensus. Our current system, in my lifetime, is a coin flip of whether or not that candidate receives a majority of all votes cast. But by design, in ranked choice voting, the winner will receive a majority of the votes. That means that we get leaders who actually represent a larger group of us. Ranked choice voting also creates more choice in the system, which means that instead of fearing that you may spoil an election by voting for a third-party candidate, you can gladly mark them as your first preference. This allows third parties a legitimate shot at growing a constituency without fear of spoiling the results of the election. More choice is good for democracy. And because of that choice, it has been shown that this kind of voting system greatly reduces the negativity of campaigns. Instead of focusing on disqualifying opposing candidates, the incentive is to try and get other candidates' voters to list you as their second and third choice. Take the beginning of our example. In a world where everyone is vying for second and third choices, you could see a campaign where Luka tries to court the voters of the other candidates. He tells Brunson voters that they should vote for him because he's kind of like a guard, but also has the second highest three-point percentage of the 5 candidates behind Brunson. He argues to Shea voters that, like their preferred guard, he too is the team's primary ball handler. To Jokic voters, he reminds them he's second in assists of the candidates behind their preference in Jokic. And he appeals to Giannis voters that he can still play bigger and actually leads all of the candidates in points. Armed with this information, the voting could very easily look like this after the first runoff. Jokic 50, Shea 40, Luka now with 40 with Brunson's votes going to Luka, and Giannis with 20. After round 2, Luka is now leading with 60 votes thanks to Giannis's votes and Jokic with 50 and Shea with 40. Round 3 then runs with Luka amassing 100 votes, 2/3 of all votes, and Jokic still having 50. Again, this is obviously a very simplified example, but it shows how appealing to other candidates' voters is what is incentivized. Every candidate in an election should want to earn your vote. Our current system in many ways has tended towards empowering winning on the ideological ends of the spectrum. And ranked choice voting often empowers a more moderate and consensus candidate to win when they otherwise, from the first run of voting, wouldn't have stood a chance. And moderation may not sound very exciting, I get it, but I'd argue that consensus is. The goal isn't to change your values or moderate your opinions, it's to incentivize better candidates. Candidates that want your vote and know that they have to earn it. Ultimately, I think we'd all agree our political system could use one, if not many, improvements. But I'd argue this would be a very effective place to start. Ranked choice voting is already being used statewide in states like Alaska and Maine. Cities like New York, Minneapolis, San Francisco, and Cambridge also use it for their municipal elections. So if you want to learn more about ranked choice voting, some helpful resources for me are in the description below, and the different organizations have different ways to get involved. This kind of change is a real layup. I would say it's a slam dunk for voters everywhere. Okay, I'll stop with the puns, but what do you think? Which NBA player do you think should be president? Wait, that was the takeaway, right? If you enjoyed this type of crossover between sports and other things, I hope you consider liking and subscribing and maybe sharing this video with someone. And until next time, thanks for learning something with me, and get out the vote.